I spent $8,000 to destroy a wedding cake, and it was the best money I've ever spent. Not that I paid for its destruction directly. That cost was absorbed somewhere in the chaos and shame that followed. But when I think about the value I got for my money, the actual expense is almost laughable. My sister Chloe made sure of that. Let me start at the beginning, though not the real beginning. The real beginning would take us back 30 years, to a nursery in Atlanta where my parents brought home their second daughter and decided almost immediately that she was the special one. But I won't do that to you. Instead, I'll start where it matters, with the wedding invitation. I was 30 years old and had finally found someone worth marrying. Jonathan Pierce was a surgical fellow, the kind of man who came with the kind of pedigree my mother had always whispered about in her special, reverent tone. Old East Coast money. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that pays for things quietly and expects nothing in return except good manners and an understanding of which fork to use. My mother fell in love with his last name before I did, but that's not fair. I did love him. I loved his calm. I loved the way he listened to people, really listened. Not the performative kind of attention people usually gave me. He was kind in a way that felt earned rather than inherited, which made it mean something. When he proposed, a simple sapphire on a Wednesday evening in our apartment, I felt something crack open inside me that I didn't know had been sealed shut. I could be happy. I could have something that was just mine. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the engagement. Chloe called my mother, who called me, who then had to listen to my mother explain why I was being selfish. "Your sister is devastated," my mother said. She had a particular way of delivering this information, as though I had personally wounded Chloe by getting engaged without first consulting her on whether she could emotionally handle it. Chloe was 27 and had been calling herself a lifestyle influencer for the past 4 years. Though I'd looked at her Instagram once and found that she had roughly 3,000 followers and posted pictures of herself in restaurants she couldn't afford, in clothes she charged to credit cards she'd never pay off, in a life that existed primarily in the two-dimensional space of her phone. She had no stable income. She had never held a job for more than 8 months. She had, according to my mother, a different kind of talent that didn't require traditional employment. What she required was attention. Constant, uninterrupted attention. And when she didn't get it, she became the victim. "She was hoping you'd ask her to be maid of honor," my mother continued, and I could hear in her voice the thing that had always been there, the assumption that I would comply, that I would, as I had my entire life, make myself smaller so that Chloe could feel larger. I was going to ask her, I said, which was true. I had planned to ask her, even though the thought of it made me feel slightly ill. The wedding planning was already stressful enough without adding the variable of my sister's unpredictability and her habit of making everything about herself. "Then why didn't you?" my mother asked, and I realized she had caught me in the small pause where I was calculating how to handle this. My mother was very good at catching pauses. She had spent 30 years learning to read them. "I didn't ask yet. The engagement was 3 weeks ago. I haven't asked anyone yet." But I could hear the disbelief in her tone. She didn't believe that I would ask Chloe at all. She believed that I was cutting her out, punishing her, making a statement about my superiority now that I was marrying a man with money. This was the pattern. This had always been the pattern. My accomplishments were somehow a tax on Chloe. My happiness was Chloe's injury. My boundaries were Chloe's trauma. I called Chloe that evening and asked her to be my maid of honor. I did it because I knew what wouldn't happen if I didn't. There would be months of my mother calling with variations of the same wounded tone. There would be family dinners where my father would make some distant reference to loyalty and family first. There would be the subtle message underneath everything. "You have done well for yourself, Rebecca, and the least you can do is make sure your sister doesn't suffer for it." Chloe accepted with a kind of triumph that I should have recognized for what it was. She had wanted something, and the machinery of our family had delivered it to her, as it always did. I was just the conduit. The real trouble started when we went to the bridal salon. I had found a dress I loved, not the elaborate white confection that made every bride look the same, but something smaller, more elegant. Ivory silk with a subtle drape. It cost more than I'd ever spent on clothing, but when I put it on, I felt like myself. Like Rebecca, who could have nice things. Like Rebecca, who deserved to feel beautiful on her wedding day. Chloe stood in the corner of the dressing room with my mother and the bridal consultant, and I watched her face as I turned to show them the dress. She looked at me the way she had looked at me my whole life, like I had taken something that belonged to her. "You're basically wearing an expensive slip," she said. "It's elegant," the consultant said quickly, sensing tension. "It's depressing," Chloe said. "And you're the bride. The bride is supposed to be the most beautiful person there. That dress looks like you're trying not to be noticed." I felt my mother's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would handle this. This was always the test. Would I stand up for myself, which would make Chloe feel bad, or would I capitulate, which would make me feel bad? My entire life had been a series of these impossible choices. "I like it," I said, and the firmness in my voice surprised me. It also surprised Chloe, who raised her eyebrows. "Well, I'll probably look better in my dress anyway," she said, which was her way of ending arguments. By comparing herself to me, in a way that sounded like a compliment to me, but was actually a declaration of her superiority. For the bridesmaid dress, she chose something in a deep jeweled tone that was, objectively, beautiful. She also chose a price point of $800. "That's for the dress," the consultant said. "Alterations are additional." I heard myself agree to pay for it before I had really processed what I was doing. This was my role. I was the older sister who had resources, and my job was to make sure my younger sister never felt the particular sting of not having them. "Thank you," my mother said, and I understood that this gratitude was not directed at me, but rather, she was acknowledging that I had passed another test. I had done the right thing. I had sacrificed. I had kept the peace. In the months that followed, the peace became harder to keep. Chloe decided that she had opinions about every aspect of the wedding. The guest list was too large. She felt like she was competing for attention. The venue was too fancy. It made her uncomfortable. The color scheme was too predictable. Could we do something more unique? Could I think about her experience instead of just focusing on myself? She also wanted to invite people. People she knew from Instagram. People she was networking with. People I would later learn, who included a man named Derek Brennan, who worked in pharmaceutical sales, and who, my best friend Sarah would tell me later, had a reputation for being the kind of person who could get his hands on almost anything. But I didn't know that yet. I just knew that my fiancé's mother, Diane Pierce, had a very specific vision for the guest list, and adding Chloe's random Instagram friends would disrupt it. I told Chloe no, gently, in the way I had been taught to refuse her. She reacted as though I had committed a betrayal. "You're embarrassed of me," she said. We were on the phone. I was at work. "That's not true. You're embarrassed that I'm not some East Coast legacy like your new family. You think I'm not good enough to be seen with them." "Chloe, that's... Mom said I could invite them. Mom said it was fine." This was the escalation pattern. When I said no, she would go to my mother. When my mother tried to negotiate on my behalf, my mother would also try to negotiate with me. The goal was always to exhaust me into compliance. "I'll talk to Mom," I said, which meant nothing. We both knew what it meant. The wedding was 6 months away at that point. 40 weeks of this. 40 weeks of Chloe finding new things to be upset about. New ways that my happiness was her injury. New opportunities for me to choose family peace over my own preferences. But I had Jonathan. That was the thing that made it bearable. I had Jonathan, who listened to my frustration with the kind of calm attention that suggested he wasn't trying to solve me or convince me that I was overreacting. He simply held space for my anger at my family, my sadness at the fact that I couldn't have a happy occasion without my sister turning it into a referendum on whether I loved her. "You could just uninvite her," he said once, not cruelly, just as a practical suggestion. "I can't do that," I said, and we both knew it was true. I couldn't do that because I had been raised with the understanding that there were things you didn't do to family, no matter what they did to you. You sacrificed. You kept the peace. You made yourself smaller. What I didn't know then was that Chloe was making herself smaller too. She was just doing it in a different direction. She was drowning in debt. I wouldn't find this out until much later, but from what Sarah could piece together from mutual acquaintances, Chloe had been living a lifestyle she couldn't afford for so long that the gap between the image and the reality had become almost schizophrenic. She was charging designer bags to credit cards. She was taking out personal loans to pay for experiences to post about. She was carefully curating a life that was completely fictional. And then I got engaged to Jonathan Pierce, whose family name was recognizable in certain circles, whose bank account was presumably substantial, whose future was so much more secure than hers would ever be. And my parents started treating me differently. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle. When I called home, my mother would ask about Jonathan before she asked about me. When my father called, which was rare, he would ask about Jonathan's surgical interests in a tone of pride I had never heard when discussing my own career. They had a new interest in my life because my life had become attached to Jonathan's credentials. What I didn't realize, but what Sarah pointed out to me months later, was that my parents' newfound interest in me was not kindness. It was a form of social climbing. I had been the successful one, the one with the good job, the one who had achieved things. But now I was the bridge to something even better. And Chloe, for the first time in her life, was not the special one. She was the one who was falling behind. This is the part that matters, I think. This is the part that led to everything else. Chloe had built her entire identity around being the chosen one, the creative one, the one who didn't have to follow the rules because she was too special for ordinary expectations. My parents had reinforced this her entire life. She was talented. She was sensitive. She needed protection from the harsh realities that people like me were built to handle. And then I got engaged to a man whose family had the kind of status that made Chloe's carefully constructed Instagram empire look like what it actually was, a desperate, beautiful lie. 3 weeks before the wedding, Chloe asked to meet me for coffee. This was unusual. Chloe didn't typically initiate one-on-one time with me. We saw each other at family functions, which were always supervised by our parents, always carefully managed to prevent the kind of honesty that might disrupt the family narrative. We met at a coffee shop near my office, somewhere neutral and public. Chloe was dressed carefully, the way she always dressed. She looked expensive. It was remarkable how good she was at looking expensive while having no money. "I've been thinking about the wedding," she said, stirring her latte with the kind of precision that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation. "Okay," I said, waiting. With Chloe, there was always more. "I think it's going to be amazing for your career," she continued. "Networking with Jonathan's family, all those East Coast connections. It's going to be huge for you professionally." "I'm not marrying Jonathan for networking," I said carefully. "No, of course not," she said. And I heard the thing underneath the words. The accusation that I was, the assumption that I must be. But it's lucky, isn't it? That you're marrying someone with those advantages. Not everyone gets that lucky. I looked at my sister across the table. She was 27 years old. She had lived her entire life as the golden child, the one with infinite potential, the one who would probably be fine because people like Chloe were always fine. But now she wasn't fine. She was desperate. And desperation, I was learning, made people do things that politeness normally prevented. "I'm sorry that you feel like you're struggling," I said, which was a delicate way of acknowledging what I was seeing without making her feel like I was attacking her for it. "I'm not struggling," she said immediately, and the defensiveness in her voice told me everything. She was drowning. "I'm just saying that life isn't fair. Some people get handed everything, and some people have to build everything from nothing. Chloe, and it's fine," she continued, cutting me off in a way that was very deliberately kind, very deliberately martyr-like. "Really, I'm happy for you. Even if you've always had everything easier than me, I'm genuinely happy. This was the thing about Chloe. She could deliver cruelty wrapped in the language of love. She could tell me that I'd had everything easier than her, while the entirety of our childhood stood in contradiction to that statement. She could frame her envy as generosity, her resentment as support. I left that coffee meeting feeling shaken in a way I couldn't articulate to anyone. Sarah tried to comfort me. Jonathan tried to rationalize it. But I felt it in my body, the way you do when you sense that something terrible is coming, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. The week of the wedding, my mother called with news. "Your father and I are very proud of you," she said, which was immediately suspect, because my parents did not typically lead with pride in me. "We're looking forward to the wedding." "Thank you," I said, waiting. "We wanted to let you know that we've decided to step back a bit from helping Chloe financially. She's 27. She should be standing on her own." This was shocking, not because it was the right decision. It was, profoundly, but because my parents had never made it before. They had spent 27 years telling me that I needed to help my sister, that I needed to be understanding, that I needed to be the strong one. "Why now?" I asked. There was a pause. "We think she needs to learn some lessons," my mother said carefully, "about responsibility." I understood in that moment that my parents' favor had simply shifted. I had become the one worth investing in. Chloe had become the one who was on her own. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. Not the kind of pity that helps, but the kind that comes from understanding that your sibling is about to do something desperate, and you're in her path. The rehearsal dinner was at a small restaurant in Savannah's historic district, the kind of place that had exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and the casual elegance that suggests the owners don't need to prove anything. My family was there. Jonathan's family was there. Sarah was there in her role as my best friend and unofficial protector. Chloe was there too, and she was exactly what I expected. Charming, self-deprecating, funny. She told a story about me that was technically true, but designed to paint me as uptight. She complimented Jonathan in a way that felt like it was designed to suggest she had better taste in men than she actually did. She performed. She was good at it. Sarah pulled me aside at the bar. "Your sister is acting weird," she said without preamble. Sarah was a litigator, which meant she was trained to notice inconsistencies. She was also my oldest friend, which meant she had been observing my family dynamics for long enough to understand the baseline of dysfunction and to recognize when something was beyond it. "She's always weird," I said. "This is different," Sarah said. "She's been touching glasses, like, really attentive to the glasses. I've watched her pick up her water glass like 4 times and put it down without drinking." I felt something cold move through my chest. "What do you mean, touching glasses?" "I mean, she seems very interested in where glasses are, where they're placed. I watched her stand behind your chair for like 5 minutes just looking at the table setup." The cold feeling spread. "You don't think—" "I don't know," Sarah said carefully. "But I know you. And I know you're about to marry a very successful man. And I know your sister is about to be financially cut off by your parents for the first time in her life. I know she's been posting increasingly unhinged things on her Instagram, and I know she met with some guy named Derek at the mall 2 weeks ago, who, when I looked him up, sells pharmaceutical supplies to hospitals." "Sarah, I'm just observing," she said. "I'm just suggesting that you be very careful tomorrow, about what you drink, about where your drinks come from, about who has access to your beverages." I wanted to tell her that she was being paranoid. I wanted to tell her that my sister, no matter how jealous, no matter how desperate, would never do something that dangerous. I wanted to live in the world where people didn't cross that line, but I had known my sister for 30 years, and I had learned over and over that she was capable of hurting me in ways I didn't expect, because I kept expecting her not to. "Okay," I said. "The wedding day was a study in composure, which is what I do well." I woke up at 6 in the morning in the hotel suite that the wedding planner had arranged. My mother and Chloe were sleeping in their respective rooms down the hallway. Jonathan was at his hotel, following the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony. I took a shower, I had my hair and makeup done by professionals. I put on my ivory slip of a dress, the one Chloe said was depressing, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I recognized. I saw myself. Not the version of myself that was constructed for my family's comfort. Not the version of myself that made my sister feel better by taking up less space. I saw Rebecca Lawson at 30 years old, about to marry a man she loved, about to begin a life where she got to decide what that life looked like. The ceremony went perfectly. Jonathan cried a little when he saw me. My father walked me down the aisle with the kind of pride that felt earned rather than transactional. The vows I had written, carefully, thoughtfully, made Jonathan laugh and made me cry. We were married. The reception was held in a ballroom that the hotel had decorated according to Diane Pierce's exacting specifications. There were chandeliers that cost more than my first car. There were white florals that had been imported from Ecuador. There was a champagne tower that looked like a piece of art. And in the center of the room, elevated on a table with perfect lighting, was the wedding cake. It was 6 tiers of red velvet with ivory fondant and handmade sugar flowers. There was edible gold leaf, applied by an artist whose day rate was probably more than my monthly student loan payment. My mother had gasped when she saw the price estimate. My father had said nothing, which meant he was thinking about what the cake said about his status. But I loved it. I loved that it was beautiful and expensive and mine. The head table was set up in the exact configuration I had requested. Jonathan and I were in the center, flanked on either side by our parents. Then came the wedding party. Sarah was on my left, next to Jonathan's best man. Chloe was on Jonathan's right, in her jeweled bridesmaid dress, looking like she belonged in a magazine. I watched her during the cocktail hour. She was studying the room. She was noting where things were placed. She was building a map in her head, I realized. She was planning. When everyone sat down for dinner, I watched her hands. She had them in her lap for much of the meal. Then, at some point, when I wasn't looking directly at her, I caught her making a movement toward the champagne flutes that had been placed for the toasts. The flutes were arranged in a specific way, one for each person at the head table, identical, crystal, expensive. I had already made a decision, I realized. Somewhere between Sarah's warning and the vows I had made, I had decided that I was going to be ready. I was going to stay present. I was going to watch. The dinner proceeded. There were speeches. Jonathan's father, who was a quiet man in the way that powerful men sometimes are, spoke about gaining a daughter. My father, after a drink or two, spoke about Rebecca having really done well for herself, in a way that seemed to suggest my greatest achievement was marrying well. Sarah stood up and told a story about meeting me in law school, and knowing immediately that I was going to do great things. And then she had a choice about whether to talk about what those great things actually were, or whether to make it about my accomplishments being worthwhile, because I had married well, and she chose the former, and I loved her very much for that. Then they announced the maid of honor toast. Chloe stood up. I watched her hands as she picked up her champagne flute. I watched her look at the table, at the arrangement of glasses. I saw the moment of uncertainty cross her face, the question of which glass was hers and which one was mine. It was a moment of hesitation that lasted less than a second, but I saw it. And in that moment, I made my move. I had been holding my champagne flute loosely on the table. As Chloe was standing, getting ready to begin her speech, I made a show of shifting in my seat, of being slightly inattentive. When she lifted her glass, I shifted a serving plate slightly. When she was looking out at the room, I switched our glasses. Hers moved to the center of the table where my original one had been, and mine moved to where hers had been. It was a smooth movement. No one saw. The glasses were identical. The champagne was identical. The only difference was what had been placed in one of them. I watched Chloe notice, after the fact, that she was holding a different glass than she thought she was. I watched the understanding flicker across her face, that something had changed, that something was not right. But what could she do? Stand up in front of 300 people and accuse me of something I hadn't done? switch glasses back, and reveal that she had been up to something. She made her choice. She began her speech. "Rebecca," she said, smiling at me, and the smile was the same one she had been giving me my entire life. The smile of someone who had never had to truly work for anything because everything had been given to her. "My amazing, accomplished, beautiful sister, I have always been so proud of you." This was a lie. She had never been proud of me. She had been envious, resentful, and waiting for the moment when I would fall far enough that she could feel better about herself in comparison. "And Jonathan," she continued, "I have to say, you are one of the luckiest men in the world. You have no idea what you're getting into." There was a knowing tone to this, a suggestion. It could have been the typical maid of honor humor, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested she knew something we didn't. "She might seem like she has it all together," Chloe continued, "but there are sides of Rebecca that not everyone sees." I felt the room's attention sharpen. This was not standard maid of honor speech territory. This was something else. "We've always had a complicated relationship," Chloe said, and she was drinking now, between sentences, sips of the champagne that did not belong to her. "Because Rebecca has always been the one with everything figured out, and I've always been, more sensitive, more creative, more in touch with my feelings." The speech was devolving, I realized. She was not doing the thing that she had probably planned to do, which was maintain the facade of support while making subtle digs. Instead, she was losing the thread. Her words were becoming slightly less precise. There was a hesitation between her thoughts that hadn't been there when she started. "And the thing about Rebecca," she said, and her smile was becoming less controlled, less practiced, "is that she has never really understood what it's like to want things and not have them. She has always had everything." I watched her take another drink. I watched the glass move to her lips, and I realized she was consuming the substance at a faster rate than would have normally happened, as though her body knew something was wrong and was trying to process it quickly. "But now she has Jonathan," Chloe continued, and her words were definitely slurring now. "And she has his money, and she has his name, and she has everything she ever wanted. While some of us—" She paused. She blinked. Clearly, something was happening in her body that she didn't understand. "While some of us have to figure out how to survive on our own for the first time." I felt the room shift. I felt the awareness that this was not a happy speech. This was not a maid of honor celebrating her sister. This was something darker, something more honest, something that revealed the resentment we had all been pretending not to see for 30 years. "And that's fine," Chloe said, but her hand was shaking now. She set the glass down on the table. "That's really fine. Rebecca deserves to be happy. She was speaking more slowly. Her eyes were slightly unfocused. She was still standing, still holding the microphone, but she was no longer entirely present. "I just think," she said, "that it's interesting that some people have to work for everything while other people just get lucky and marry into money, and suddenly they're the hero of the story, and no one cares that maybe their sister is struggling, and maybe their sister is drowning, and maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she listed forward slightly. I watched it happen with a clarity that felt almost dreamlike. I watched my sister, who had spent her entire life as the special one, who had been protected and enabled and excused her entire life, who had been told that she was talented and creative and sensitive and therefore not responsible for her own actions. I watched her reach for the table to stabilize herself, and I watched her miss. She went forward, and the grace of her fall suggested that her body was no longer entirely in her control. She went into the wedding cake, the 6-tier, $8,000 handmade sugar flower, edible gold leaf-covered work of art. She went into it completely. Her face, her dress, her arms, all of it. The cake crumbled and collapsed beneath her weight. Fondant went everywhere. Sugar flowers disintegrated. Edible gold leaf became indistinguishable from the red velvet cake that was now covering my sister. The room went absolutely silent. For a moment, no one moved. No one made a sound. 300 people watching a woman they had been introduced to as the maid of honor, the bride's beloved sister, collapse into a wedding cake in the middle of a champagne toast that had revealed something none of us were supposed to say out loud. Chloe tried to stand. She slipped on the cake and sat back down hard. Her dress was ruined. Her hair was matted with frosting. She was crying, I thought, though it was hard to tell what were tears and what was cake debris on her face. And then, just before Jonathan's father, who was a cardiologist and therefore used to staying calm in crises, moved toward her, I heard something that made the room go even more quiet. Chloe muttered something. Her words were very slurred, very difficult to understand, but the microphone was still on. "Wrong glass," she said. "That was the wrong glass. I put it in." She didn't finish. Jonathan's father reached her, assessed her for medical emergency, and the professionalism of his response snapped the room back to motion. People were calling for medical help. Someone was trying to help Chloe up. Someone else was standing frozen. But I heard what she had said, and so did Sarah, and so did everyone in the vicinity of the head table. I put it in. I felt Jonathan's hand find mine under the table. I didn't look at him, but I felt him understand. I felt him piece together what had happened. My mother was standing now, looking between Chloe and me with an expression of dawning horror. My father was looking at Chloe like he had never seen her before. The paramedics arrived. They were efficient. They checked Chloe's vitals, assessed her condition, determined that she was conscious but heavily sedated on some kind of substance that was causing loss of coordination and slurred speech. They asked questions that no one answered correctly because no one was supposed to know how the substance got there, except my sister had told them. She had confessed, semi-consciously, in front of an audience. One paramedic looked at me directly. "Did she consume alcohol tonight?" "Yes," I said. "Any other substances that you're aware of?" There was a pause. Sarah said, "I saw her put something in the bride's drink earlier." This was not technically accurate. Sarah had seen Chloe put something in what she thought was my drink, and I had switched the glasses. But the moment was too important, and the truth was too dangerous, and so Sarah improvised. "That's the champagne right there," Sarah continued, pointing to my original glass, the one that still had the liquid in it. I was going to warn her, but there wasn't time. Everything moved very quickly after that. The paramedics secured the champagne flute as potential evidence. My parents were given the choice to get in the ambulance with Chloe or stay at the wedding. They chose the ambulance. My father's departure was silent. My mother looked back at me once, and I saw in that look all 30 years of our relationship compressed into a single moment of understanding. "You did this." And I saw that she knew. Not just that I had switched the glasses, but that I had done it deliberately, that I had let it happen, that I had, in some fundamental way, given my sister exactly what she was reaching for. She turned away and followed Chloe to the ambulance. The party remarkably continued. I had expected people to leave, to be uncomfortable, to see the reception as now tainted by family drama and violence. But something else happened instead. People looked at each other, and I watched a collective decision being made. We are here to celebrate. The people who belong here are still here. The person who tried to hurt the bride has been removed. Let's celebrate. The DJ played a slow song. Jonathan pulled me onto the dance floor. The wedding cake was gone, but there was still champagne. There was still music. There were still people who loved me and had come to celebrate my marriage. I danced with my husband, and I felt something inside me relax that had been tense for my entire life. The thing I had been holding, the weight of keeping my family together, of managing my sister's feelings, of making myself smaller so that she could be larger. I could feel it loosening. By the time the night ended, people were dancing. We had ordered emergency replacement desserts from a restaurant kitchen. Someone had started a ridiculous dancing competition that Jonathan's cousins were dominating. My mother-in-law was laughing at a joke someone had told. The wedding had become what it was supposed to be, not a performance of family solidarity, but a genuine celebration with people who chose to be there. Sarah found me at the end of the night, when the party was winding down. "You did it," she said. "I didn't do anything," I said. "You absolutely did," she said. "You let her think she was winning, and you switched the glasses, and you let her take the dose meant for you. And now everyone knows what she tried to do, and everyone knows that you're clever enough to handle it." "It's not clever," I said. "It's just sad." "It's both," Sarah said. "That's what makes it beautiful." The aftermath was not as clean as it could have been. Chloe was taken to the hospital and kept for observation. The substance in the champagne was identified as a high dose of something that would have rendered me unconscious for several hours, something that would have turned my wedding night into a medical emergency, something that could have caused serious harm if I had consumed it. My parents tried to call me the next day. I didn't answer. They tried again the day after. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally looked at my messages, there were 8 of them, each one a variation on the same theme. "You have to forgive her. She was just stressed. She didn't mean it. Family is family. We need to move forward, Rebecca. You're so strong. Can't you just let this go?" One message from my father was different. It was just 2 words. "She's lost." This was the closest my father had ever come to acknowledging that Chloe had done something wrong. Not, "She's making mistakes," or "She's going through something." Just, "She's lost." An admission that the special child, the one he and my mother had always protected, was actually failing. Not because of circumstances or bad luck, but because she had not been equipped with the skills to survive without constant protection. I played that message 3 times, and then I deleted it. I contacted a lawyer. Not Sarah, because this was bigger than friendship. I contacted a lawyer and asked about restraining orders. I asked about the legal ramifications of what Chloe had done. I asked what my options were. The lawyer was very clear. If I wanted to press charges, if I wanted to pursue this legally, I could. But it would be public. It would be a trial. It would force me to relive this in court. I asked him what would happen if I chose not to. "Then it goes away," he said. "Civilly, anyway. Legally, it depends on whether your sister has other consequences coming. The hospital will have been required to report the incident. Police may investigate. But if you don't press charges, you're free of it." I chose to be free of it. I blocked my parents' phone numbers. I blocked them on email. I told my mother, in a brief text message, that I was entering a period of no contact, and that if she attempted to reach me again, I would be seeking legal intervention. I told her that I would reconsider this position in 2 years, and that at that time, she and my father could request a conversation. Until then, I was done. I meant it the way I meant very few things in my life. Chloe attempted to reach out through Instagram. She sent me several messages expressing remorse, explaining that she had been desperate, that her life had been falling apart, that she wasn't thinking clearly. She told me that she understood if I couldn't forgive her, but that she hoped I could someday understand what it had felt like to be me, privileged, confident, chosen by the world, and then to suddenly face the reality that she would have to actually work for things, that her parents had decided she wasn't worth protecting anymore. The messages were articulate. They were, in some ways, honest. They were also completely missing the point. The point was not that Chloe was sad or desperate. The point was that she had chosen, in that desperation, to hurt me. And she had put her hands on something sacred, my wedding, my celebration, my life, and tried to corrupt it. I didn't respond to any of the messages. After a month, I also blocked her. The investigation revealed what we all already knew. Chloe had purchased a powerful sedative from Derek Brennan, the pharmaceutical sales representative, using money she couldn't afford to spend. She had planned to slip it into my champagne during the reception. She had believed in her own mind that this was justified, that I deserved it, that my happiness was an injury to her, and she was merely balancing the scales. The police recommended charges. I refused them. Jonathan asked me why. "Because prosecuting her doesn't help me," I said. "It just keeps me tied to what happened." "But she tried to drug you at your own wedding," he said. "I know," I said. "And now I know who my family is, and I know what I'm willing to accept, and I know that I never have to be around them again." That's its own kind of justice. He understood, I think, that this wasn't forgiveness. It was freedom. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life in a way that didn't include my original family. My in-laws were kind in a way I had never experienced before. They didn't expect things from me. They didn't ask me to manage anyone's emotions. They simply included me in their lives. And when I mentioned that I had no contact with my parents, Diane said, "Good for you," and nothing more. Sarah became even more important to me. I realized, in that period after the wedding, that the people I actually needed were not bound to me by blood. They were bound to me by choice. Sarah had seen the danger and warned me. She had backed me when I needed backing. She had not asked me to forgive my sister for her own comfort. I got pregnant about 8 months into my marriage to Jonathan. I carried that pregnancy carefully, aware in every moment that I was creating a person who would not grow up the way I did. There would be no golden sibling. There would be no pressure to sacrifice myself for someone else's ease. There would be respect for all of my children equally, or there would be hell to pay. Jonathan and I spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of family we wanted to create. We talked about how we would handle favoritism if we had multiple children. We talked about how we would teach them to manage their own emotions, to take responsibility for their own choices, to understand that love was not the same as protection from consequences. When our daughter was born, I looked at her perfect face, and I made a promise to her, and to myself. I would never tell her that her worth was dependent on making her siblings feel better. I would never ask her to take care of someone else's emotional needs. I would never teach her that peace was worth more than truth. I would give her the thing I never had, the freedom to be fully herself. And I would give her something else too, the knowledge that some people, no matter how related to you, are not safe, and it is not a failure on your part if you have to cut them out of your life. It is not a betrayal of family. It is an act of self-preservation, and self-preservation is not selfish. It is survival. 1 year after the wedding, on the anniversary of my marriage, I got a letter. It was forwarded to me through my lawyer's office, which suggested that my mother had sent it knowing I wouldn't accept it directly. I almost didn't open it, but I did. My mother's handwriting had not changed. It was the same careful script I had seen my entire life, the same controlled formation of letters. She told me that Chloe was in therapy, that Chloe was finally taking responsibility for her actions, that my mother and father were working through some things about how they had raised us, that they would respect my boundaries, but that they hoped eventually I might consider a conversation. She closed with, "You are our daughter, and we love you, even though you have hurt us deeply by abandoning your family in our time of need." I read that last sentence 3 times. I had not abandoned them. I had removed myself from a situation that was not safe. I had protected myself from people who had repeatedly chosen my sister's comfort over my well-being. And somehow, in my mother's mind, this was a betrayal. I kept the letter in a drawer for 3 months, and then one day I took it out, and I read it again, and I felt nothing. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation. I felt no pull toward reconciliation. I felt, instead, a clear and perfect sense of freedom. I was no longer waiting for the day when my family would change, when they would see what they had done, when they would apologize in a way that actually meant something. I was no longer hoping that they would choose me over the narrative they had constructed about themselves. I was done. I threw the letter away, and in that moment, I understood something that I think I had always known, but had never quite allowed myself to feel. My life was mine. It was not a performance. It was not a negotiation. It was not an endless series of sacrifices designed to keep other people comfortable. It was mine. And that finally was enough. I am Rebecca Lawson. I am a senior brand strategy director. I am married to a kind man who loves me. I am a mother. I am the woman who, at her wedding, let her sister drink from the wrong glass. And I have never for a moment regretted it. Some people would call that heartless. Some people would call that cruel. But I call it the moment I saved my own life. And it was worth every dollar of that destroyed cake.